So we can start. Hello everyone and welcome. I am Yağmur Civan Uyanık. I am the administrative assistant at Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, known as ANAMED. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar meeting. For this month's talk, titled A Book Talk, Cities as Palimpsests, Responses to Antiquity in Eastern Mediterranean Urbanism, we are hosting Elizabeth Key Fowden, former ANAMED fellow Suna Çağaptay, Edward Zychowicz-Coghill, Göksun Akyürek, Assaad, Seif, and Caroline Goodson. The talk will be moderated by Emre Erkal, who is an architect with experience in architectural and urban design projects, applications, and research on several facets of contemporary cities and settlements. Prior to his professional emergence degree from Harvard University Graduate School of Design, he completed a Middle East Technical University Electronics Engineering Department and worked as a researcher at Bilkent and Indiana Universities, as well as Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Following his PhD degree from Istanbul Technical University, he has been teaching classes and workshops in architectural and urban design, interactive technologies, and digital design. Recently, he has been teaching architectural studios and computational design at Middle East Technical University, Department of Architecture, and he is currently conducting projects in historic city centers of Istanbul and Antalya, where issues of archaeology, conservation, cultural heritage, and geography and technology intersect. A Q&A session will follow the talk. You are more than welcome to write your questions into the Q&A button throughout the event. I also would like to inform you that the microphones and videos of all attendees are turned off automatically and that this event is being recorded. Now I am leaving the microphone to our moderator Emre Bey to introduce our speakers and start the conversation. Have a great talk.
Hello. It's a great honor to be the moderator for such a great book. I would like to begin by introducing our participants and begin by the co-editors, of course. Elizabeth Key Fowden is both a co-editor and a contributor. Grounded in her training in classics, Elizabeth Key Fowden's research has focused on religious, political, and architectural intersection in late antique and early Islamic Greater Syria. Her current book project, The Parthenon Mosque, Fowden applies her interest in Islamic reformulation of the classical and Christian inheritance to the early modern conjunction of Greek, European, and Ottoman views in the City of Sages. Elizabeth helped formulate and organize the impact of the Ancient City Project's International Conference, Cities as Palimpsests, also served as the co-editor for the volume. She is Senior Research Associate in Classics and Fellow of the Center of Islamic Studies at Cambridge and co-PI of the Cambridge-Stockholm project Greece Between Europe and Asia, which includes a recent workshop on Mediterranean embroideries co-organized with Deniz Türker in Kavala, Greece. Suna Çağaptay, who is also a co-editor and contributor, is a medievalist working on artistic and cultural interactions in the Eastern Mediterranean and their reflections on the built environment. Currently, she is a research associate on the impact of the Ancient City project at the University of Cambridge and the postdoctoral research associate at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge. She is the author of The First Ottoman Capital, The Religious, Architectural, and Social History of Bursa, 2020, as well as several articles focusing on aspects of medieval frontiers, spolia, and identity appearing in Mukarnas, Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies Journal, and Dumbarton Oaks papers. She is a researcher at the Civilization Studies Center, MEDAM, at Bahçeşehir University in Istanbul. Suna is one of the organizers of the Impact of the Ancient Cities Project's International Conference, Cities as Palimpsest, as well as acting as a co-editor for the volume. Edward Zychowicz-Coghill is a lecturer in the history of Asia at King's College London. He was previously a research associate on the impact of the Ancient City project. He is a cultural and intellectual historian of the early Islamic world, whose work encompasses early Arabic historiography, visions of the pre-Islamic past, and economic imaginaries. Publications include the first annals, fragments of Umayyad history 2021, and Writing the Conquest of Egypt, the formation of early Islamic historiography, which is forthcoming. Ed also is one of the editors of the volume Cities as Palimpsests. There's another co-editor of the book, Louise Blank, but she couldn't join us today. So, I can move on to Göksun Akyürek, who is a contributor. Göksun is an architect and architectural historian working on the 19th and 20th century history and theory of architectural production of various scales and contexts, mostly focusing in Istanbul and Turkey. She received her bachelor's degree in architecture from METU, Faculty of Architecture in Ankara, master's in architectural history from the same university, and her PhD from Yıldız Technical University in architectural history in Istanbul. She also studied in Budapest as a visiting scholar at the Budapest Technical University. Her published studies include Ottoman architectural history of Tanzimat, Istanbul, 19th century housing market of Istanbul, early Republican formation of Ankara, and the 20th century history of tourism architecture in Turkey. Currently, she is working as an assistant professor and teaching architectural design and history at Bahçeşehir University in Istanbul. Assaad Seif is an archaeologist, a university professor, and UNESCO ICOMOS heritage expert with 30 years of experience. Dr. Seif held first-line positions at the Lebanese Ministry of Culture, ranging from the head of the archaeology and heritage research departments to serving as an advisor for the Minister of Culture. He is a member of the editorial advisory board of CMAS, Conservation and Management of Archaeological Sites, a Taylor and Francis publication. He is also a research consultant at the National Council for Scientific Research, CNRSL. Building on his wide archaeological fieldwork and urban archaeology experience, Dr. Assaad Seif is a UNESCO and ICOMOS expert. Dr. Seif is well acquainted with the current situation of cultural heritage management and conservation, archaeological research, cultural project implementation, as well as cultural dissemination, community engagement, and awareness raising in the Arab countries in general and Lebanon in particular. We also have a guest from University of Cambridge, Caroline Goodson. Her research concentrates on the nature of power in this part of the early medieval world, looking at how different groups positioned themselves as successors to the Romans' past glories or as innovators in a new world order. She is particularly interested in how cities facilitated certain forms of social interaction and political authority, and how changing religious practices and politics related to day-to-day experiences, and how these have been transmitted to us through material and textual records. Her work deliberately moves between the disciplines of history and archaeology. She has published extensively on medieval documentary and historical texts, such as chronicles, hagiography, and more recently, charters and diplomata. So we can, after the introduction, I guess we would like to start discussing the topics. This is a quite rich and extensive book with quite a wide array of complex ideas. So it would be, I think, worthy to talk about how it came about and how it did start and in which context it belongs to. So maybe Elizabeth, you would like to elaborate on that?
Thanks very much for introducing yourself. Thanks, Emre. Yes, we have to begin with Andrew Wallace Hadrial, who I hope is maybe among the people listening today, because Andrew Wallace Hadrial was the applicant. He's a cultural historian of Rome, the Roman world, but with very, very wide interests, such that he could devise a very interdisciplinary project with difficult questions coming from a classics faculty. So Andrew Wallace Hadrial applied for a big ERC grant, which enabled us, and I got in at the end of it, to work especially on the Eastern Mediterranean and to bring in my own particular angle, especially as someone who's coming from the late antique world and moving increasingly towards the Ottoman and getting more and more involved with the questions that students of Islamic material culture are asking. And that was a very rich intersection with Andrew and his thinking about what interdisciplinarity means. Well, why do you bring together archaeologists, architectural historians, textual historians, both from the Carolingian world, from the early Islamic world? We have a very rich, we have people who work on, tend to have a lot of people working on water. So environmental urban issues have been prominent in the East and in the West. What do you do with people who are trained in such a wide range of disciplines? That was really one of the fundamental questions. It was, we chose the city, or Andrew chose the city as that problem we would all be addressing. But what really excited and enticed me to join is how it's crossing what we call now epistemic modes, really. It was crossing different disciplines and the different sorts of questions we ask of our material, and the way in which, as historians, I mean, I'm a historian, but archaeologists, we all in this group were doing it, how we operate on two different levels at the same time to find our questions. And we both are, we function through engagement with our sources from the period that interests us, but we also engage with irritation with the questions that our contemporaries are asking. I mean, I think a lot of what we do as scholars is listen to each other. And that was what, it was a great exercise with a big group of people, up to a dozen people talking together around a table. And sort of arguing or saying, well, actually, in my field, we come at it a different way. So it's also the different ways of knowing of the historical persons we're studying, but also the different ways of knowing among ourselves. So that's why I mentioned, so Andrew came to the whole project with an irritation about the grid. This idea that what remains of the ancient city is this ancient, is a Greek and then Roman idea of a proper, clean city is a city that has straight lines. And this sort of worked against, the historian finds these easy categories really irritating. And that's why I think irritation is an important part of being a part of these complex groups. And so the grid became one of the metaphors that we worked with throughout the project. And for the Eastern group, actually, the palimpsest became one of our, it's a metaphor that also has a practical reality. That's what's interesting about both the grid and the palimpsest. They work at both levels. So I would say that this project grew out of how we as scholars work together from different angles, different disciplines. And our project especially links into what in the Eastern, the legacy of the Greek and Roman worlds in the East, a problem that it's a really booming period right now. And I think maybe, I'm hoping with this book, we've been able to engage with some of the fundamental problems there, which are how we've projected a singular way of knowing about the past, which is a Latin or Greek, which anyway were multiple, onto our material. So in this book, in a way, we're trying to show there were many different ways in multiple periods, the Arabic world, the Ottoman world, coinciding in the city. So I won't say anything more about the city. The city became a space in which we as scholars of different backgrounds were thinking together, arguing together. That's the great thing about having a group of people. And I hope Andrew's here, and I'm sure that he would agree that the irritation is really important for all of us, because it's not just the material that we command as specialists, but it's also, we're a community of people that has to find a way to engage with each other. And that's when, I hope we can discuss this, that's when this whole question of audience and heritage and how we present the living city today is going to be communicated, only if we've argued about it. So that's a start about where we began.
Yeah, some of this process is evident in the introduction, which is a very dynamic and stimulating essay, and it proposes new questions and new directions. And some of the process is not written, of course. So I'm curious about the practical issues of handling the editing, crafting, that process of the book itself. I mean, would you like to talk about this? Maybe Ed can add something.
Can I say one thing right now is that I think that we are actually allowed to, and Suna has a hand up, but because, as I said, we like to argue, I think that when I say, or if somebody says something where someone wants to leap in, we could experiment to see whether in the Zoom that's possible. Suna's got her polite hand up already, but
obviously.
But
yeah, I think, Suna, did you want to come back to something that Elizabeth said?
Yeah, if you want to pick up on something I said.
Yeah. I think I just wanted to go back to the idea of having irritations. And I do recall that in one of our earliest meetings, we went back to the idea of the ancient city. And we basically questioned when we talk about the idea of ancient city, we often remember the Greco-Roman city. And we said, there are so many other versions of the ancient city around there. And I think throughout the project over the 4 or 5 years, one of the things that I often observe that, when we think about the ancient city, we have to keep our options open, and we have to think of other versions of city building or city making. So that's the irritation part and the interjection that I want to come back to. And I'm going to turn over to Ed now by lowering my polite hand.
Thanks. Yeah, so with regard to the kind of practical process of bringing together a volume like this, so I mean, I think Elizabeth sketched some of the kind of bigger ideas that kind of drove us towards this topic. Slightly more pragmatically, one of the ways that this volume comes out of a group of people that we brought together, whose work that we were particularly excited by and thought could help us to address these sets of questions, which which Suna in the main, although with support from the rest of the team and colleagues here at Bahçeşehir University, organized in, gosh, was it 2018?
Yes.
Yeah, it was in May 2018. And so we brought together this group of people and had a kind of very lively 3-day conference in which we had a group of people who weren't exactly primed to engage, to kind of forward a particular vision of the palimpsest, but were asked to kind of interrogate this idea and this idea of the palimpsest and whether or not it is a useful way of thinking about the ancient city and its heritage and its continuing and ever renewing and changing role in the city. And to kind of see whether they could use it, whether they could challenge it, see whether they could introduce alternative ideas, alternative symbols or metaphors that could be used to better conceptualize this idea of living cities with deep pasts and how those pasts continue to replicate themselves within the cityscape or are drawn upon by actors within the city. So we had this conference. It was kind of sprawling, exciting, people disagreed with each other, and we thought that this would be the great material for a volume. And we then asked people to send in contributions on the basis of their papers, but also interacting with some of the points made by the moderators and the people who were wrapping up at the end of each day. And then we received the papers, and one of the things we were really keen on was that with this team of 4 editors, everyone would read the papers. So when authors got their comments back, I think this is right. I think we went to the length of each of the 4 editors having read each paper and added their own comments on it, which were all kind of combined by our valiant administrative assistant, Beth Clark, into a kind of, with the help of Elizabeth and Suna in particular, into a kind of general response to each contributor, which we hoped would then form the basis for a kind of revision, which happened over, I don't know, over the course of about 6 months, a year. And so, yeah, this was great for us in the fact that we were, particularly when we're editing this volume, really in deep on with all of the contributions. And this, I think, allowed us to write an introduction which was really engaging with a set of ideas existing in the literature, which was part of our starting point, which its second kind of point of engagement was this series of seminars, which the project held, weekly seminars during term time over 3 or 4 years, which we had a variety of other guest participants coming in from Cambridge and elsewhere. And then the third thing, really engaging with these ideas of people from outside the project, which really helped to feed into the themes that made up the organization of the book, which were derived from ideas which came up as kind of sticking points in the conference. Yeah, and so when we were writing the introduction, we very much had in mind the ideas of the contributors, because although we were kind of feeding back and trying at points to ask contributors to engage with particular aspects of their ideas, which we thought really worked for the volume, those ideas were also feeding into our sense of what the problematic of the palimpsest was. So it was a very kind of dialogical exchange between the contributors, or at least it felt that way from our perspective. And then with the introduction was again co-written by the 4 collaborators in the midst of COVID. We imagined that we would all be sitting in a room and that we would be kind of bouncing off each other, and I don't know, it'd be like some American film, we'd be eating Chinese takeout out of cardboard boxes or something. In the end, we were just sadly in our own rooms, locked away, which may have been safer for us actually. But so this was so different bits of the introduction would be written by different editors, and then that would be then passed on to other editors to kind of re-edit or rephrase, add other information. So it is quite a melange of different voices in the introduction. And so there've been quite a lot of palimpsest formed. The sheer number of Word documents and editions where you've got the different initials of each of the contributors were kind of mind-boggling at times. And although I think that certain of our voices come through strongly at different points in the introduction, it was very much collaborative effort.
So you mean even though the conference was obviously earlier, but the book was written in a period. This book on complex urban realities was written in a period where there was no urban complexity at all. Due to COVID.
Yeah, it was written with the deserted streets outside.
Yes. So I guess it would be relevant. I mean, to talk first about this metaphor of the palimpsest with the question mark. Of course, I mean, it's the whole book is a reflection on that, and you know, there are many takes on it. But let me ask this plainly first, if anyone wants to reflect on the palimpsest as a metaphor, maybe it's good to discuss that at the moment. Or if, or we can, let's say, take it and as we all know, and we would like to emphasize with this book, it is this process of urban activity is still going on, and societies evolve, cities have a life, and modern societies continue to add new layers in multiple ways. So how do you think the metaphor of the palimpsest would contribute to the modern conceptions or practices of heritage, let's say?
I'll just leap in. Oh, did someone else? I'll just say something very brief. Am I unmuted? Yeah. About your first, more general context, why the palimpsest. And I suppose one thing we wanted to do is to just remind us all that there's a danger in when terms get too habitual. And that was really the question mark. I think none of us felt that it wasn't useful at all in the end, the palimpsest. And during one of our, not only Ed left out one stage, was that not only did we write it, and then when we finally got a certain draft, then we circulated, of course, to the members of the group. And so they all discussed the introduction as well. And one of the comments was, well, so do you think palimpsest works or not? Does it work enough for the city? And because we don't give an answer to that. I definitely want to make it clear that we're not saying palimpsest isn't useful. It's very useful, but I think I'm maybe to begin with to blame. So I feel to bring in this idea of palimpsest, because I thought that it's getting overused, and maybe when we overuse it, when it actually dribbles down to the very wide public, just Google it. It's very wide. Then we had to make sure that it cycles back and that we actually ask, how is it useful? And so it's very useful in thinking about time. And I think that unfortunately, it was on at midnight. I wasn't able to watch Barry Flood recently, several months ago, gave a paper called "When is a Palimpsest?" which is a very good question. But for us, it was really not so much, very few of us really think of palimpsest in terms of a building. Our question was to say, because it works much better for a building than it does for a city. And so that's all I want to say. In terms of framing it, it was important to see how it works in terms of time, but also question how useful it is. How much it depends on individual awareness. And that would link in, if anyone else wants to pick up then now on its usefulness, as you say, today in the wider heritage context you mentioned. That again links in with the individual viewer. So how do you make that idea of a palimpsest that has a sense of time and not just material, useful to a wider audience? Assaad probably has something.
Yeah. In fact, it is interesting what Elizabeth was saying, because if we take it in its linearity, palimpsest as a historical process is easy to catch, to understand. But when we come to a city where we have different temporalities, different evolutions, and some elements of the city remains for a long period of time. So this linearity is broken and reshuffled sometimes. And this is what makes it intriguing and at the same time challenging to approach it, the city, as a palimpsest. And this is why lots of different, let's say, concepts were socketed into the basic concept or trope of the palimpsest, where you have juxtapositions, where you have something that is completely gone or something that is half gone and then repaired and continued. So these different evolutions, temporalities, and complexities add a challenge to the concept itself as a linear concept where you have eraser and then a new thing, then eraser and then a new thing. And in archaeology, it is very interesting, especially with the evolution of the concept and the concepts in archaeology, where before archaeology was conceived as a geological formation process where things are naturally deposited one over the other. And now we are in a different aspect of this approach to archaeology, especially in the urban context. But if you bring this palimpsest from the underground, from the archaeological substratum, let's say, to the level of the city space and the cityscape, it becomes also interesting to see where it fits, how it fits, and how the dynamics are intertwining on the city level. And this was a challenge, at least for me, in my approach to Beirut, for example, where we have different evolutions, different, let's say, crystallization of some parts of the city because of different reasons, of course, and some parts of the city still evolving. So, and within the same, let's say, vellum of the palimpsest, we have something that is yesterday or the day before, and something that is way beyond. And this is the complexity that was challenging and intriguing at the same time.
I would like to have a little remark, just to as a note. The famous cognitive linguist George Lakoff has a couple of books on metaphors, where he challenged the classical idea of linguistic metaphor, which basically says that a metaphor is a linguistic artifact. His theory was more of an embodied experience and embodied concept. But what is interesting about his theory was, obviously, when we talk about metaphors, we want to validate them, but it becomes interesting when we want to falsify them. So according to his theory, a metaphor cannot be falsified by logic, can only be falsified by empirical observations that are guided by other metaphors. So that's an interesting take on metaphors. And I think it would, you must have felt a lot regarding the palimpsest and the cities, because it's a difficult, very difficult job. So if we want to talk about cities, I mean, I would like to, as an architect, the most pressing issues about cities, and especially this is a very hot topic for urbanists and architects, what we do with the public space. So it's arguably central to urban life, something the city provides its citizens with. But this kind of formulation, what makes a city, and this kind of essentiality of public space, was not framed with Eastern Mediterranean cities in mind, if you look at the history of these ideas. But so it would be interesting to hear about your reflections on the fabrication, evolution, and intricacies of publicness, and how it plays out spatially in the cities you have studied. And Assaad, maybe you have in your essay interesting takes on that.
Yeah, in fact, how I saw Beirut, it's the city is a result of a power struggle. So the most powerful leaves his imprint on the cityscape, and it is a continuous change. Wherever power changes or shifts, we have a change in the city. And this is what happened in Beirut in post-war reconstruction, where each of the communities struggled to have a footprint in the city, and a very widely screaming footprint, in using heritage, and mainly religious heritage sometimes, to restore their powers and their presence in the city. And it is very interesting because the dynamic works on new monuments and old monuments that are reinterpreted. And this is where the biased interpretation of history, of the past, comes into the scene. And this is where you see that there is always a present past. The past in itself does not exist outside the observer, as Elizabeth was saying, or the person who interprets the past. So the past is something that we take, it's something that is illusional. We take and we make it happen through our interpretation of it. And this living past is always, let's say, changed, metamorphosed, according also to the powers that are interplaying in the cityscape. And this is what happened in Beirut, where some community, for example, observes an archaeological feature in its premises and interpret it in a way to say that this is a continuum example, evidence, sorry, that we were in the city since X time. And this way they have a kind of confirmation or eligibility of being in the public space of the city today and to expand their powers. Others, they used new elements, new, let's say, architectural elements to impose their presence in the city as newcomers also. So each community placed itself in a city in a different way by interpreting the past or using the past for different reasons or different aims. But at the end, what we have a patchwork of interpreted pasts in the city that each community take part of it. And when we want to read it, we read a patchwork. But for them, it is a continuum. It's not a patchwork. And this is interesting. So we have the past, we have the interpretation of the past, and we, as historians, people who want to interpret the past, we are in the middle, and we are trying to decipher the things that we see into something that we can explain. And it's interesting and challenging at the same time.
So this volume engages with the ancient past also, almost like 1,500 years. So this is what you described in a nutshell, has been going on for a while. So you know what continuities or discontinuities do we see over the entirety of this period? So are there ways of perceiving the ancient city which are distinctly modern, for instance? Göksun, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, sure. Actually, as a maybe late architectural historian, I'm dealing with the 19th century. I won't be able to talk about all this, long period, but maybe looking through my particular contribution and discussion on Istanbul and its mid-19th century perception of maybe this Divan Yolu Avenue, which was, partially ancient Messe. Actually, by the chance of this, maybe having the chance to reflect on this concept of palimpsest, I started thinking about why, for instance, the Ottomans preserved the column of Constantine, Çemberli Taş, standing almost in the beginning of this avenue, which was, brought to the fore, made visible in mid-19th century, but in fact, it was standing there for quite a long period of time.
appreciated and preserved by the Ottomans in the long centuries in between. So its base, that Baroque base, has been rebuilt actually in either late 17th century or 18th century. The date is not certain, but actually my modern mind could not tell why would the Ottomans, because they did not know exactly why the column was there. There were, of course, myths and legends about its protective powers, that it belonged to Constantine, but they preserved it. I mean, even before there was this modern notion of archaeology or preservation. So they renovated those iron bands, and they built the base. And it was left in the middle of houses. It was burned and, you know, harmed, but it was still preserved. So I think our modern minds maybe still cannot understand why and how the Ottomans preserved this column. So it has an urban role, I think. It stands there as an urban object. It contributes to this public space and public imagery, public memory in different ways over centuries, and modern way of, you know, preserving things. I think it's not the same. So these old objects, old layers, actually they were resilient and they existed there through different practices. We cannot maybe define very easily today. But they somehow survived there. They somehow, you know, continued to exist. So I think we need to appreciate that. I mean, the old societies actually had their own practices of heritage, or had their own practices of preservation, conservation, and our modern minds maybe are not. I mean, we cannot fully understand those dynamics, that those objects somehow lived within these societies. So, I mean, now we need some information, you know, text or knowledge to be able to appreciate many of these objects. But in those centuries, I think the people appreciated the material cultures differently. I mean, they could tell that, for instance, in the case of column of Constantine, they could tell that that's a precious stone, the porphyr stone, for instance. They could tell that, okay, this is something rare in Istanbul, and this is precious. And maybe the value of the column, I mean, in addition to many of its features, the size, height, etc., also came from its material culture. And now, you know, as I started questioning these dynamics, I appreciated more, actually. And maybe our modern minds are more problematic, because we need to associate these layers with certain identity politics, and we search for meanings. But maybe for pre-modern cultures, that didn't mean much at all. They were much more, I think, maybe pragmatic, but they had their own value system, and these objects had their places in it. Maybe not as problematic as they are today.
The column of Constantine is a great figure to discuss these issues. I think you also mentioned resilience, and also in this volume you characterize Eastern Mediterranean as a region with resilience more than rupture. So where do you see resilience in the history of the region cities? I mean, do we see rupture at all? And if so, how do you see resilience overshadowing it? Maybe Suna would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think we went with the idea of discussing the notion of resilience as the revolving pattern in the Eastern Mediterranean urban patterns. I think our starting point was the fact that, maybe I should just speak from my own scholarly experience. We receive our trainings in different disciplines, and for us, if you're trained as a Byzantinist, you are supposed to deal with the Byzantine layers. And if there is an Ottoman layer in front of you, you don't have an understanding of it. So you just assume that the Byzantine period comes to an end for one way or another, and another layer begins. And then you assume that there's a discontinuity, there's a rupture in the culture. There might be differences or changes in the regime or the political scene, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is reflected in the cultural production. And with the palimpsest metaphor, I think one of the things that we came upon was the fact that, we were also interested in understanding the communication between what was original, right? What was there originally in the first glance, and what was the thing that was scraped up and reinscribed or rebuilt on top of the original. So I think we asked our contributors, or overall, when as the co-editors were doing the meetings, we were mainly interested in understanding this communication. And we thought understanding and observing this communication from one culture to another would help us to get the dynamic sense of the metaphor of the palimpsest. One of the things that Assaad mentioned, the idea of linear palimpsest, which I find very fascinating. And as an archaeologist, we love linear palimpsests, I think linear layers. But often in the architectural context or the urban silhouettes, we get vertical palimpsests. And archaeologists are often trained, really well-versed in understanding habitation or detecting the clues for habitation, but we are not very skilled in terms of identifying abandonment, war, or stuff like that. And I think, again, juggling between those two worlds, understanding the habitation versus abandonment, understanding linear versus vertical, were the things that we decided to put up front in order to play with this notion of the palimpsest or the metaphor of the palimpsest, so that we can talk about the continuity, regardless of what kind of a training we got, in which period, in which city, or which cultural setting.
Okay. Is there anybody else that would like to? Okay, Caroline.
If I could just add a few words to that. One of the really interesting things to me that has emerged out of this volume is the juxtaposition of disciplines. And this point that Suna is talking about is a really relevant one, that archaeologists don't always know what to do with emptiness in the stratigraphic record, and that we're quite good at distinguishing a change in a stratigraphic layer, but when that change happens and what happens in the gap is impossible to see in the archaeological record. And so texts do sometimes give flawed but illuminating explanations and accounts for that sort of transfer of what happens in between those layers. And I'm intrigued, Emery, by your question about public spaces and how public spaces in the Eastern Mediterranean might be different from public spaces anywhere else in the Mediterranean world or in the post-Roman world. And public spaces are often empty spaces, aren't they? They're spaces where things can happen, and structures and buildings and conditions and legislations and regulations sometimes constrain the way those things happen. But from the archaeological perspective, they're voids, aren't they, in our understanding of the urban record? So critical to the functionings of cities, materially absent. And I don't think that's peculiar to the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that's the nature of cities probably all over, but certainly cities that are inherited from the Roman world. And so this kind of interdisciplinary engagement with these questions is surely the only way to explore these, and the not only interdisciplinary, but how to say sort of longue durée, the sort of exploration over very long periods of time, has clearly provided really quite exciting insights here.
So you mentioned the other part of the Mediterranean as well. So the project, which is an umbrella for this book, I guess, covers the whole Mediterranean. Well, whereas this volume focuses on the Eastern Mediterranean. So do you find significant differences in the impacts of the ancient city, for instance, between these two areas? Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I'm sure I can start with that, although everyone else I think will have an opinion on the matter as well. Do I find a difference? Well, I mean, there are some differences which the editors of the volume highlighted a bit in their introduction. That one of the things that's quite noticeable about the area that's being considered here is the sometimes quite radical political, cultural, religious shifts that these cities underwent, and those kinds of ruptures. We don't have to call them ruptures, but those kinds of shifts are less pronounced, I think, in many of the cities of the Western Mediterranean. I think that's probably fair to say. One of the things that I thought about in rereading this book in advance of this conversation, and I was reminded of by thinking about Gökson's comments about materiality, is perhaps a banal observation, but major sources of stone for the Roman world are in the Aegean and in the Sea of Marmara and in the Eastern Mediterranean, let's put it that way. Are there more stone buildings in the Roman cities of the East, which then sort of give rise to different shapes? If I think about the cities in Italy, if I think about the cities of Gaul, they're built of tufa or brick, or there are other building materials to be sure. Certainly there's ashlar stone and there's quarried marble from Italy and from North Africa, of course. But there's when I think about the cities that are investigated and interrogated in these chapters, one of the things that rings out to me is that the legacy and the obduracy of the Roman period buildings is really quite striking. That's something that I noted and was a little bit surprised by when I first read the volume.
Very interesting take, yeah. So yeah, I mean, please.
Could I come in on that? I mean, I think that's a really interesting structural point about the very material constraints on what provokes this kind of reflection on antiquity. And on a personal note, as someone who's always worked on the Eastern Mediterranean or the early Islamic world, I remember being shocked when I first went to Rome and finding these brick buildings still standing and surviving. And so, I mean, I guess they're not entirely, they're not intrinsically transient, but yes, these enormous stone constructions in the Eastern Mediterranean do provoke and demand interpretation, I think, in a way that we see in lots of different cases in this volume and in other volumes as well. Another thing that I'd point to, and again, this comes from your point about these shifts, or are they ruptures? In some ways, the whole story of the transition to the early Islamic period, contrasting the Eastern and the Western Roman empires, is one in which you've got a kind of cultural and ideological apparent continuity in the West, in which there are enormous structural changes in terms of urban patterns of living, patterns of taxation, and you can kind of flip that in the East, right? You've got essentially, a new large superstate arising, which is taxing, which can sustain a professional army, which is building stone monumental buildings on a vast scale, while absolutely, shaking off, apparently, explicitly rejecting the ideology of what went before. This isn't the continuity of the Roman Empire, although, of course, a big part of the kind of the good and important work of the kind of long early Islamic late antiquity has been to show the ways in which the articulation of new early Islamic power dynamics it really does involve the reception of Roman ideas, or in many cases, but also Iranian ideas and ideas from Arabia. So it's this kind of new melange, but it's articulated in a new language. And I think that language shift is fundamentally one of the big things that you have to take into account when talking about the difference between the West and the East. So a good example of this would be another output of the volume, the project, is this a journal's special edition on the kind of looking at citizenship in the medieval West and the ways in which ideas about citizenship or kind of urban belonging in the medieval West relate back to or not kind of classical ideas. And we mooted whether or not we could do this for the East as well. And this was kind of relatively early on in the project. And then it just became obvious that this threw up a whole entirely different set of problems. If you're looking at this in the West, you can trace concepts, you can do kind of conceptual history where you look at words or cognate words and you can trace their history and the shifts of meaning that they undertake over centuries and the way they're re-employed and how that reflects changing social structures or ideas. Or you can look at medieval Latin writers who can read Cicero and who can actually receive these ideas and engage with them explicitly. Whereas to do something like that in the East would to do a kind of comparison of urban attachment and its relationship or not to the classical ideas of urban attachment would be a great idea, but it would require you to completely abstract all of these concepts of citizenship from the linguistic field within which they're in, and then to try and search for the best ways of tracing those in the East and the West. And although that's a terribly exciting idea, it was one that unfortunately we weren't able to, we thought, well, that's an entire project in itself. And it's far beyond the kind of the remit of this project, although it could have been a part of it. You know, the brief of the impact of the ancient city is an enormous one. And that would have, and could encompass all kinds of things. So that's a kind of a road not tread. But I think that ultimately, and again in the East, when you have that linguistic disjuncture, that then leaves open the space in some cases for a more creative reinterpretation of the kind of stone and monumental structures that we're talking about. So in my contribution to this volume, I talk about the ways in which Roman monuments in, say, the Amman, the city in modern Jordan, Roman remains being reinterpreted as part of the biblical past. And so you've got people applying interpretations to Roman remains, which they can fit into stories and narratives which they feel fundamentally a part of, and which integrate those parts of their cityscape into systems of meaning which are important to them. And maybe that refers back a little bit to one of Emre's earlier questions to Göksun, and which Göksun's chapter really made me think about with the column of Constantine, in that this kind of modern project of isolating it and identifying it as an ancient ruin that is separate from the current temporality, maybe, you know, Göksun's chapter made me think about maybe that is one of the radical breaks, because in a lot of cases that we're looking at, people aren't isolating the remnants of the past from their own temporalities, but they're seeing them as they're having very strong interactions with them. I've spoken for quite a long time there, so I'll stop blethering. But those are just stimulating set of ideas, I thought.
Actually, maybe I can jump in here, because I mean, that's modern thinking, and that's radical, I think. When when I read the book and when I see these pre-modern ways of relating with these maybe old layers and objects and cultures, you know, things are more maybe organic in many ways. But the modern mind and its way of relating and I think appropriating is quite radical, and maybe we can see it more when we see earlier ways of communicating with these ancient layers.
There is an idea in the book which might be instrumental, the idea of multiple pasts of cities. So maybe, Assaad, would you like to elaborate on?
Yeah. In fact, I elaborated a bit on that in my bit of research. The multiple pasts of the city are the past of the people who lived in the city. So when you have in Beirut, for example, different communities, you have different pasts, different interpretations of the past. And no interpretation is what we call the truth, because it doesn't exist. So the multiple pasts are the multiple interpretations of the present past as interpreted by the different communities living in one city. And here also comes the concept of what we call heritage, our heritage. In fact, we have different heritage in Beirut for the different communities, because in itself, heritage is a construct. When you stage, like Caroline was saying, materiality, and this is very interesting. Archaeology, for example, is the science of materiality. When you get material culture from previous periods, you stage them in a way and you do your own interpretation of the relation you have between them, and you have a community that goes for it, it becomes heritage. It becomes a past that is accepted by the community. So which past we are looking at? And this is the question, because these are the different present pasts as interpreted and as acquired and validated by the communities that are living in one city, in a nutshell.
Yes, these are continually inhabited cities,
yes.
Right? So
yes.
They have both deep and living pasts, and you also emphasize this element of urban experience, the living pasts of the cities. So
yeah,
Ed, would you like to comment on that, or
yeah.
or Assaad, if you want to?
No, living past is for me an oxymoron. You see, the past is the past. We make it living through our interpretation of it. So it's a continuously metamorphosed past according to the interpreter and to the historian who interprets it. So living past is a nice, quite interesting and challenging oxymoron for me. I don't know. I will leave Edward to continue.
Well, I think it fits quite well with your idea of present pasts, which also, you know, has that oxymoronic element to it. But I mean, I think that idea of looking at living cities was fundamental to the project as well. And I think this, I mean, Elizabeth can correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of came from Andrew, which was this, again, frustration or an annoyance with using or the tendency for cities which have ceased to be inhabited as icons or standard cases for understanding particular periods. So, you know, you could look at, say, Timgad in North Africa, in modern Algeria, as being this perfect, seemingly perfect kind of Roman city, all well laid out, excavated, and you know, you can see the different types of monuments and everything, seemingly telling us everything we need to know about the city in a particular phase. But I think there is something, you can challenge that by saying, well, how representative can these cities be? The cities that exist in this way for total archaeological exploration are, by definition, the cities which failed. These are the cities that died. So in a way, far more revealing are cities that lived, but they are much harder, harder to reveal themselves. So yeah, I think we wanted to get away from these pristine archaeological sites because there's also this sense that they can be manipulated in some ways by those kind of archaeological modes of reconstruction that Assaad is talking about. You know, you can choose which layers you want to expose, you can choose which monuments you want to reconstruct if you want to, or kind of emphasize within the city plan, because you're presenting it as if it's one entire living snapshot. But you know, this doesn't really work, because all of these, you know, an excavated total site kind of, I don't know, it gives the idea that any deviation from that pristine city which existed there in that one moment, any change which necessarily happens in a living city is a kind of deviation from an ideal norm. And so getting away from the idea that there are these kind of well-separable layers that we can associate with different civilizations, and that often you know, people choose to identify or prioritize the representation or the study of particular layers. And obviously the classical layer is an important part of kind of Western self-fashioning, and has a big role in, say, colonial undertaking. Archaeology of sites in the Middle East and North Africa has been kind of bound up in colonial justifications of their, you know, presence in certain of these places. This is particularly the case, say, in North Africa and French excavations in Algeria, but it also has a role in other places in the Eastern Mediterranean, as we talk about a little bit. So the idea was to focus on living cities with deep pasts, and to, yeah, get away from this idea that the ideal city, or the city that we should be imagining, is this one kind of one moment site, but really thinking about city lifespans through pulses of, you know, construction, dilapidation, renovation, abandonment, and rehabilitation that are all existing, you know, at the same time, and yeah, integrating different, and recognizing that in these living cities, different temporalities are coexisting in the urban landscape.
So
I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that.
I had a sense that a good deal of stuff might have been included in this volume, but you weren't able to. So if you, what would you like to add to this volume if you were able to? Suna, would you like to answer that?
I think it's just the perfect volume. No, I'm just joking. Yes, I think, I mean, in itself, it really helps us to understand or examine whether the metaphor of the palimpsest would help us or wouldn't help us when we are studying the cities. I think that's what the volume is trying to do, because of the question mark in the title. As a person who was working on the Balkans, on Anatolia in the medieval period, I would like to have one more paper on the Balkans. For example, we had a paper on Athens, another one on Thessaloniki, but a paper focusing on somewhere outside Greece would be great, but I don't think it's a big minus anyway. Also, you know, paper dealing with Egypt would, I think, contribute to the volume. But thematically, we had those 4 subheadings, and we collated all the papers on those 4 titles or subheadings. And I think overall, the way that we dealt with each subheading, like the juxtapositions or the accumulations. The second one was the erasure and selective memory, and then we had the relationship between the new and the old, and who's past. I think the way that we collect all those papers focusing on different cities, different cultural settings and chronologies, in a way, they all dealt with how useful the palimpsest of the metaphor of the palimpsest would be. So I'm not too critical at this point, because it's still a pretty brand new, hot off the press, I should say. Maybe in the upcoming years, I would have a different or a more critical view of it. So that's my take. Yeah.
Elizabeth, please.
I just actually want to ask Carolyn her opinion, because what we really wanted from Carolyn is have a critical outsider. But I would, and also to have some, if there is an audience, to hear some questions from the audience. But I would really like to push forward the problem of contiguity of these multiple paths. I think this is something that came up in some of the papers, but something that I think we need to think about more in the future is, yes, we can identify different ways of giving meaning to the past, especially I think it was important for all of us, this idea of, it's come up several times, not separating things out into neat categories, that which I think is what Göksun is referring to as the modern way. But so how do we envision today possibly proposing, as well as observing in the past, when you get the contiguity, the simultaneity of these multiple ways of encountering remnants of the past in your urban space? That's something I think that we could push more. But anyway, you don't have to say anything, Caroline, but if you do have, given that, if there are things you would also wish us to push, all of us to push forward, that would be great.
I can't say I read the volume and said, oh, there's a giant gaping hole here where no one's considered something. I take to heart very much Suna's lament that there should be more Balkans, and I think that there are parts of the sort of Roman world, or there are ancient cities in the Eastern Mediterranean that there are territories that are well trod. Constantinople certainly is for very good reasons among those, but there are certainly other places that could have been considered, and one is confronted by the disparity of research trajectories, right? That there is such a sort of concentration of research for many periods in certain areas, and such a lack of research of these kinds of themes in others. So that's a fact of the modern world. Do you know what I think the sort of the important thing to take away from me, and something that I feel like I have tried to think about in my own work, is that by juxtaposing, as Assaad did, multiple modern approaches to a monument, by working through, as Goodson did, this sort of series of interventions around a single monument, and figuring out the laminations, if we want to throw another metaphor in here, the sort of laminations of certain sites and monuments, we get a real sense of this the way that you can have simultaneous interests in a site or a place or an idea at the same time. Surely it was always that way. Surely cities in the ancient world were not fixed and stable entities either. And so there's a way in which it's very easy to assume that we know what a Roman city was, but in fact a Roman city was in its own self a shifting, multi-layered entity, and that produced new and infinitely different trajectories that are really, really quite difficult for us to trace. But we would do well to use the heuristics of our scholars who are working on the more modern past and think about ways we can find them where our evidence is a bit more sparse, I think.
We can have questions from the audience. So far, there are no questions, but we certainly encourage. Just for just to satisfy my curiosity, I mean, in working for such an undertaking, you have brought together textual, material and visual evidence together. So how this kind of process enriched your contributions or the volume in general? Do you have something to say?
Can I go ahead, or is
Sure.
there someone? Yeah. I think when I look at the volume and around the time when we were working on the volume, there were two major strands that came out. Some of the papers were dealing with the physical city. In their perspective, they were archaeological or urban interpretations. And some of the papers were dealing with the idea of conceptual city. So they were dealing with how those cities were interpreted later on, the Greco-Roman cities in the medieval, modern, or contemporary period. And I'm trained as a medievalist. Of course, I did nothing to bring in the perspective of the modern way of looking at the city that I worked on for the book, the city of Niğde. But I think I was more open to dealing with the way that I was talking about the juxtapositions and the accumulations were coming from different cultural settings into the city of Niğde around that time, when the city was under the control of the Mongol Ilkhanids. So in a way, probably I was still in my comfort zone. I didn't really leave that comfort zone. But I think when I was co-writing the introduction, this is when I really had to challenge my own way of thinking in terms of how to look at this metaphor from an archaeological point of view, or from the point of an architectural historian or an urban historian. For example, the way how I was very fascinated by the way that, seeing Elizabeth's mind was functioning as a classicist turned into an Ottoman a visual historian, or Ed's way of dealing with the textual palimpsests, or Louisa's take on early Islamic archaeology in Jordan. So I think this is when I actually found myself collaborating. When I was writing my own contribution, I was just so focused on my own way of interpreting the monument. But then with the introduction, the whole scenario was very much different, I would say. So it was a very learning experience overall. Yeah.
Ed, would you like to go on?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so your question kind of takes me back a little bit to use of the palimpsest metaphor, and for various reasons that I mean, Caroline was going into what do you do with the kind of the empty space, the empty archaeological space, the public space of the city, and to what extent you need texts to fill in what's happening there, or the various scenarios in which interdisciplinarity is demanded. And that was clear to us from the start. That was part of Andrew Wallace Hadrial's and Elizabeth's original vision, that we would bring these people together. And in the end, I think the palimpsest ended up as quite an interesting metaphor for me, because it has this intriguing mix or a combination of text and materiality in it. And I think that's one of the things, or an idea, which I think deserves further emphasis when people are using the palimpsest as metaphor, because it's kind of, it can be too crudely used as the kind of removal of one thing and then the replacement of it with another. But I think there's, and you can use the metaphor however you want, however it's productive for you, go for it. But when you make an intervention, what we were trying to suggest was, oh well, can we think about the palimpsest more concretely and try and root it back into this kind of process, the original process that the metaphor ostensibly stems from. And so a palimpsest implies a textual rewriting on the same material support. Okay, a material support which has been scraped away. But I think that one suggestion there is that what a palimpsest, or one thing that a palimpsest points to, is how essentially the same material object can be imbibed or imbued with an entirely different meaning through, in the case of the palimpsest, writing, which I think we can take as a proxy for human thought, culture, interpretation more generally. And so I think that what the palimpsest, again, gestures towards is the potential malleability of the meaning which is applied to material realities. And so in that sense, I think that the approach gels well with the idea of the palimpsest. I think the palimpsest gestures in several different directions, and this combination of text and materiality and the particular constraints that each of them have on the other is really important. Because I think, the palimpsest isn't the perfect metaphor for the city or even for monuments, as we've said. A vellum, a parchment that is scraped away is an object which is designed to be a neutral bearer of textual meaning. And so while we can employ this idea of the malleability of meaning being applied to material objects, buildings, cities, we can also question that idea. So we can question whether a building or a monument or a city is as neutral a bearer of meaning as a manuscript which you can scrape away. And I think several of our papers effectively do challenge that. And I think particularly of Benjamin Anderson's paper on the column of Theodosius, in which he shows that this object, this classical Roman object which celebrates a particular moment of Roman history, is then reinterpreted in the Byzantine period as a kind of an omen of the future of the city of Constantinople, its later conquest. And he shows that although its kind of meaning is radically reinterpreted, its formal qualities, its material qualities, and the way the images which it depicts still exert a very strong influence on the meaning that one can produce out of that material object, unlike in the case of a manuscript, which can be very cleanly scraped away, and it takes very sophisticated digital techniques to reconstruct what's underneath. So I guess that's a kind of slightly long-winded way of saying the text and materiality do a lot of work for our volume, I think, and a lot of work within the papers.
So we are approaching our limit. We don't have any questions from the audience. If you have any other topics that you would like to mention, now is the time.
I would like to thank you for this really great discussion today. I also would like to thank our attendees too for joining us. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.